Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a little chat about performance practice, and specifically the art of ornamentation of the melody and the great controversy about when and how you should use ornaments and why you should use ornaments and the nonsense that we're told as often as not about ornaments by practitioners of the period instrument school. And, it's really a shame because it's not like we don't know what these people wanted back in the day. We really do. And when I hear some of the nonsense that gets spouted, specifically, I talk about vibrato all the time, but other things too. It's an ornament, you do this, you do that. And, of course, it's not true of the best players. There are superb practitioners of period practice who are fabulous at spontaneous ornamentation and who are tasteful and elegant and smart in the way they handle the music. So I'm not trying to make stupid generalizations. I'm really not. I just want you to hear straight from the horse's mouth what one of the great authorities on the subject said. And that great authority is CPE Bach. Now, he wrote an entire treatise, an essay on the art of playing the clavier, which was in those days, a harpsichord or a clavichord or a flugelchord or a, auto harp or whatever the heck you had. But he also wrote prefaces to some of his published collections of keyboard sonatas. And in particular, there is a fabulous collection of keyboard sonatas. It's Vodken 50, if you want to know what the number is, but it's easier to just understand them from the title, figure them out. They're called Sonatas with Varied Reprises, or Reprises, if you want to pronounce them that way. It's Sonaten mit veränderte Reprisen or something like that. I don't know. But basically what he did was he wrote out all the repeats and ornamented them. And there's not just one collection of these things. There were actually two sequels afterwards. But the main one is called the Sonatas with Varied Reprises, and they are wonderful works. But they're fascinating. They're fascinating as much for what CPE Bach says about them, as the music is wonderful itself. I mean, it really is. So I want to read to you his preface. It's not very long, but it's oh so smart and so informative. And then we'll have a little chat about it, and we'll take it from there. So you ready? Here we go. CPE Bach writes, "Nowadays, one cannot do without ornamentation of repeats. It is expected of every performer. One of my friends exerts all possible effort to perform a composition as it was written, cleanly and according to all the rules of good execution. Why should he not be applauded? Another has to rely on his prowess at ornamentation to hide his inability to express adequately the prescribed notes, and yet the public prefers him to the first. Audiences want almost every idea ornamented on repetition, without always examining whether such procedure will suit the nature of the piece or the ability of the performer. Often, only this kind of ornamentation, especially when accompanied by a long and elaborately ornamented cadenza, will squeeze applause from most listeners. What misuse, therefore, of these two real virtues of performance? No one has the patience anymore to play the prescribed notes the first time through. The long absence of applause becomes unbearable. Often this premature ornamentation is against the sense of the composition, against the intended emotion, and against the way ideas should interrelate. A disagreeable thing to do to a composer. Assuming, however, that the performer possesses all the requisites to perform ornamentation properly, is he always in the mood for it? Might he not face new difficulties when tackling unknown repertoire? Isn't the principal aim of ornamentation to do honor to the performer as well as the composition? Shouldn't the repeat produce ideas as good as the original? Nevertheless, in spite of these difficulties and misuses, good ornamentation is always worthwhile. By the way, I am referring to what I said on the subject at the end of the first part of my essay. It's a little, plug for the essay, which was for sale as well. You didn't get a coupon, but, you could get it. Anyway, he continues. In writing these sonatas, I had mostly in mind beginners and amateurs who, on account of a certain age or other problems, have neither the patience nor enough time to practice sufficiently. I wanted to create for them the comfortable and easy pleasure of making themselves heard with ornamentations without having either to invent them for themselves or to have them dictated by others and to memorize them with great difficulty. Finally, I have clearly indicated what is essential for good performance, so these pieces can be played with freedom, even if one is not quite in the mood for it. I am joyful to be, as far as I know, the first to have worked thus for the benefit and pleasure of my patrons and friends. How happy I should be if the special vigor of my pleasure to serve should be recognized in these efforts. Berlin in the month of July 1759, CPE Bach. Well, isn't that interesting? The reason that this whole topic came up originally was because I had made a point about conductors, about how there was this myth that conductors in the Romantic period were all sort of heavily interventionist, like Hans von Bülow and sometimes Mahler, and that they were, they changed things around and were very free with tempo, and then Toscanini came and everything stopped. But the reality, from what I can determine, looking at original sources, and I was talking about Pierre Monteux, I think specifically in this realm, is that there have always been two kinds of performers: the very free, very loose, very heavily inflected and mannered type, and the much more what we would call objective, but I don't think that's the right word at all, because there's nothing about objectivity here. Simply the more faithful to the score, more faithful to, it seems to be, the composer's notated intentions, the more strict in the application of rhythm and tempo, as opposed to the more flexible ones, the great example of that, as I pointed out then, was Berlioz versus Wagner. Berlioz was a strict classicist as a conductor. He tended to set a tempo and stick with it, while Wagner was Wagner. He conducted music like he'd written it, with very fluid tempos and a constant sea of change, or that's what he said. Of course, we didn't hear it, so we really don't know how strong the differences were between these two guys. They might have been quite minuscule, we tend to exaggerate these things for the sake of the point. But it's fascinating to go all the way back to 1759 and CPE Bach and see that same sort of dichotomy. The performer who is extremely faithful to the intentions of the composer and to the rules of performance and to the style and taste of the work, who is sort of ignored because of that, or the one who is more flashy and flamboyant and who plays to the crowd and who gets far more attention as a result. They both existed. They've always existed. They've always existed since the dawn of time. And we must never make the mistake, when we look at original sources, of assuming that the way things are now is unique, for a few reasons. First, we're not so far away from that time. I know we think we are, because first of all, because we have, a very limited sense of time, individually. We tend to think that 200 years is a very long time. It's not. 300 years. It's not. It's not a long time in the history of music. It's not a long time in the history of humankind. It's not a long time in the history of the planet or the galaxy or the universe or any of those things. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny little blink of an eye is what it is. And so human beings have not changed. People's personalities have not changed. Artistic personalities have not changed. They're just the same as they always were. And this is one of those statements that sort of tells us that. It really does. It also tells us something else, which is very interesting historically, for the history of performance practice and notation. And that's this. CPE Bach made a living as a composer, and a good living. He sold his works by subscription through his publisher, Breitkopf von Hertel, and as a result of that, he had to take great care to write things down. He could not leave it up to his average bourgeois home performance person to do exactly what he wanted to do. I mean, once the thing was out of his hands, he had no control over it anyway. But he wanted his audience to be able to, first of all, play his music correctly so that it would make the best effect, so that they would buy more of it. And second of all, he really wanted to educate them as to what superior performance might be, even as he says, if they weren't in the mood, or they weren't very good, or they didn't have enough time, or for all of those reasons, he wanted to make his music intelligible. And that meant being extremely carefully detailed in the way he notated his music. For that reason, we have to be, and this is something, of course, that the period instrument people know very, very well, and they're very good about it, I have to say. They understand that whether a piece of music was going to get published or not is extremely important in determining to what degree the notes on the page represent what the performers might actually have done. Because we have examples like this to show us what performers should have done. And most music, of course, in those days was not published. It was copied by hand by somebody, either freely, just shared among friends, or it was purchased in manuscript sources. And so CPE Bach was one of the very, very first composers who made a living selling music to the public. And as a result of that, if you look at his scores, if you look at the complete edition that Packard Humanities Institute is publishing, for example, it is splendidly, cleanly notated, for the most part, by the standards of the day. He was extremely careful to try and make sure that he left as little to chance as he possibly could. And so what does he have to say about ornamentation? This is what's so interesting, actually. First of all, good ornamentation is always worthwhile. That's what he says. Good ornamentation is rarely encountered, he says. That, I think, is true today as it was at any day. It's difficult to do these things. Fascinating comment that the new idea should be as good as the original idea. The idea of ornamentation per CPE Bach, and if you look at these sonatas, the sonatas with varied reprises, you can hear this. These repeats are ornamented almost to the extent of being completely rewritten. What was usually maintained in CPE Bach's day was a bass line. CPE Bach's definition of melody was the audible surface of a sequence of harmonies in order of a bass line. And so you could write entirely new tunes. That too was a type of ornamentation, a type of varying the melody, and then adding ornaments on top of that. Trills and mordents and little, doppelschlags and all German names and Prahl trillers, and you don't have to know what they're called. The thing is that there were just a whole bunch of them, but the entire piece could be changed, by somebody who was ornamenting, as long as you basically sort of kept the sense of the harmony the same. Or you could even create a whole different emotional state if it was consistent with what the overall tone and atmosphere of the music was. That was his concern, I think, that people would start, just winging it to the point where you would wind up in another composition entirely, forgetting it completely who wrote the original piece. So that's another issue that is absolutely fascinating, that the idea of ornamentation of the composer, the performers, right to manhandle the music was often taken way, way, way too far. But the other thing that's very interesting is the fact that audiences demanded it. Audiences then, as now, they wanted flash, they wanted pyrotechnics, they wanted Clement, the guy who did Beethoven's first, played Beethoven's violin concerto, who, in the middle of it supposedly played like a sonata for violin upside down, like this, of his own composition. They wanted a show. They really wanted a show. And one of the things, for example, that always comes out in the vibrato controversy, when you have all these people screaming about how it's only an ornament, you shouldn't use it that often. What you find in context is that everybody was using it all the time and audiences loved it and demanded it. And the tastemakers are railing against the practice. But we know it was there and we know they were using it. And that is true all the way up into the 20th century. There are sources from the turn of the 20th century, which I've cited before, that say things, for example, like no violinist without really nice vibrato can ever have a career before the public, because the public will not tolerate that kind of violin tone. It's very, very interesting. And so CPE Bach's public would not tolerate music without a certain fund of ornamentation, of elaboration, on repetition, on something that tells the public that the performer is putting on a show for them by doing something creative, by bringing something to the table. And, all of that is an argument in favor of not just vibrato, but all kinds of interventionism in the performance of the music. And it's a question of taste, isn't it? It's a question of how much we're willing to tolerate, how much we recognize, whether today's listeners, we're very different from CPE Bach listeners to the extent that those listeners understood what ornamentation was, because most of them were at least probably amateur performers themselves, to be able to perform things at home, whereas we are, just listeners. And so it is harder for us to come to a decision as to whether or not the performer is being vulgar and ridiculous and self-indulgent or sublime and has entered into a marriage with the composer in producing an entirely wonderful symbiotic representation of the original musical concept. It's not an easy question to answer. But I think what's important, and what I really want to stress in quoting this wonderful little preface of CPE Bach, is simply the fact that nothing has changed. Really, nothing has changed. Audiences have the same demands. Performers are under the same kinds of pressure. They fall into similar categories. That's the great mistake I constantly see in the performance practice school. The belief that because they know something, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. They can generalize about whole periods of human existence in the most broad-brushed and completely absurd way. That something was markedly different, that the expression of emotion through music was different, the aesthetics of creating vocal timbre, singing tone were different. None of that was different. And CPE Bach basically tells us that. He tells us that in writing his sonatas with varied reprises for a particular market, and in the preface when he talks about his two friends, one of whom is, unable to play the music correctly, and so he ornaments the crap out of it to hide the fact, and one who does do it absolutely beautifully and perfectly with slavish dedication to the will of the composer, and nobody notices. The more things change, the more they stay the same, don't they? And I think you can all relate to that particular dichotomy when talking about some of these micromanaging kooky conductors who shall remain nameless, Mr. Carensis. You know what I mean. They're doing the stuff to hide their inability to simply let the music speak. And then there are those who do let the music speak and no one seems to notice. Says something, doesn't it? We're all in it together, and people are people, and the situation is the situation. And the more these people yak about how different things are today from the way they were back then, the more I don't believe it. I absolutely don't believe it. Nothing has changed. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you found this intriguing and a little bit thought-provoking. Take care.